The day she first noticed the rings, she didn't try to hide it. Her eyes lingered, just a little too long, tracing the curves of the gold bands, the glint of diamonds catching the sunlight. I saw it, of course, but I smiled politely, masking the unease that flared inside me. It wasn't the first time I had noticed greed cloaked in charm, entitlement dressed as curiosity. I'd learned early that desire, when left unchecked, can erode relationships faster than anger ever could. But there was something in her gaze, sharp and calculating, that felt different. Less curiosity, more calculation. She was evaluating, measuring, imagining what could be hers if only I faltered. And I realized in that instant that this would be a long, quiet game, one where every move mattered. I remembered the day I had inherited the rings, each piece a legacy of decades, love and careful preservation. They were more than jewelry. They were stories, memories, symbols of a lineage and resilience that couldn't be purchased or replicated. The gold glimmered with history, each diamond carrying the weight of commitment, struggle and triumph. My father had handed them down with solemnity, emphasizing not the material value, but the responsibility of stewardship. The lesson was clear. To hold something precious is to honor what it represents, not merely what it reflects. And yet here was someone, the daughter of my son's bride, staring with a hunger that was almost visible, her entitlement pressing against the boundaries of respect and propriety. I decided in that moment to watch, not out of malice but out of necessity. Greed, like water, finds the smallest cracks and leaks into places it doesn't belong. She had revealed her intent without speaking a word, and I understood that any confrontation too early would only provide her with ammunition. Instead, I let her gaze linger, smiled at her politely, and maintained the surface calm that had served me well throughout my life. Every family gathering thereafter became a subtle chess match, a test of patience, perception, and timing. Her eyes returned to the rings often, though never directly. I noticed the slight tightening of her fingers when she imagined them, the small sighs, the fleeting glances when she thought no one was watching. Time, as it often does, became an ally. I had learned that people reveal themselves over long observation, that character, greed, and entitlement are best exposed by circumstance rather than accusation. The daughter-in-law, with her calculated politeness, her carefully chosen words, her feigned admiration, was slowly revealing a pattern. It wasn't just about rings, it was about control, access, and possession. She wanted to hold what she had not earned, to claim what had not been offered freely. And that desire, if left unchecked, would fester and grow, undermining relationships and respect. I reflected on the stories my mother had told me as a child, the quiet lessons passed down in moments too small to notice until years later. She spoke often about patience, about strategy, about the virtue of observation. "Let people reveal themselves," she had said, "and you will learn more in silence than in 100 arguments." I took those words to heart. The daughter-in-law's actions, her subtle gestures, the way she positioned herself in conversation, were all pieces of a puzzle that would ultimately reveal her intent without me needing to confront it directly. It was a delicate balance, maintaining civility while observing intent, but one I had long mastered. At the next family gathering, I noticed the small details. She lingered near the table where my rings were placed, her hand hovering almost imperceptibly close, as if to test my reaction. She complimented them softly, her words polite, her tone sweet, but I knew better. Compliments in her case were reconnaissance. I met her gaze calmly, thanked her, and allowed the conversation to move elsewhere. The rings remained untouched, their symbolic power intact, as I silently assessed, measured, and planned. Every encounter reinforced a truth I had long known. Desire unearned is dangerous, and lessons unlearned are costly. I began to construct a subtle strategy, one that would not only protect what was mine, but also teach the lesson that desire alone does not justify entitlement. I allowed her glimpses, small moments where she thought she might approach or touch, but each time the opportunity was withheld just enough to cultivate understanding. It was a delicate dance, one that required careful timing and consistency. The rings became a tool, not merely of protection but of instruction, a silent assertion that value is recognized, but not claimed without merit. Over time I noticed her patience fraying, the polite veneer cracking under the weight of unfulfilled desire. She would ask questions about the history of the rings, about their value, about their origin, but always with an underlying tone of calculation, of expectation. I answered carefully, deliberately, offering information that satisfied curiosity, but revealed nothing about access. Each story I told emphasized stewardship, responsibility, and history. The value was not in possession, I made sure to convey, but in understanding, respect, and care. At one point, she attempted to engage my son in conversation about the rings, testing his influence, gauging whether he might advocate on her behalf. I watched quietly as he laughed, deflected, and ultimately acknowledged that the rings were not hers to claim. The daughter-in-law's smile remained, but it was sharper now, tinged with irritation. She was beginning to understand, or perhaps sense, that her desire alone was insufficient. Ownership is not granted by wish. It is earned through respect, understanding, and recognition of what has been passed down. And in that understanding, I felt the first real shift, the moment where awareness begins to replace assumption, and patience begins to teach its lesson. I reflected on the philosophy behind my actions. Life had taught me that confrontation is rarely effective when intent is hidden behind charm or politeness. The true test of character emerges under conditions of delay, denial, and restraint. By maintaining calm, by allowing observation and reflection, I was letting the daughter-in-law confront the reality of her desires without forcing the lesson through argument. The rings, silent and gleaming, became more than jewelry. They were instruments of insight, mirrors reflecting both intent and character. Over the months, small patterns emerged. She began to linger more, her attempts to engage subtly increasing, but always within the constraints I set. I noticed frustration flashing briefly in her eyes when she realized that proximity, charm, or expectation would not yield access. The lesson, unspoken but clear, was unfolding exactly as intended. Desire unaccompanied by understanding and respect leads only to emptiness. She was learning, slowly, that greed, when unchecked, meets a quiet resistance that cannot be circumvented. Family gatherings became subtle exercises in discipline. I placed the rings where they were visible, yet always under my supervision. I allowed the daughter-in-law to admire, to inquire, to fantasize, but never to touch. Each glance, each gesture, each whispered comment became a measure of her intent, a reflection of her patience or lack thereof. And in that observation I began to understand her more deeply, not as a threat, but as a participant in a lesson she had yet to fully grasp. Desire, after all, is only powerful when balanced by restraint and respect. I remembered a lesson from my own mother about legacy. Wealth without wisdom is fragile. Desire without respect is empty. Teach them to hold value and they will carry it beyond possession. The rings, passed down from generation to generation, had survived decades not simply because of material durability, but because of the care, respect, and understanding they inspired. It was this principle I was imparting now subtly, through observation, restraint, and careful interaction. The daughter-in-law's gaze, sharp and calculating, was a constant reminder that lessons take time, and character reveals itself gradually. At one gathering, she attempted to compliment me more directly, reaching into conversational territory where I felt the edge of her expectation. I responded with calm grace, acknowledging her admiration but redirecting the focus to the history and care of the rings. "These rings have been in my family for generations," I said softly, "and they carry stories of endurance, love, and responsibility. It's not the value that matters, it's how you honor it." Her smile faltered slightly, though she hid it behind politeness. The lesson, silent but undeniable, was being delivered. Respect and understanding are prerequisites for possession. Time, as always, worked in my favor. She grew increasingly aware that her desire alone would not grant access. She attempted subtle persuasion, tested boundaries, and even tried indirect influence through my son, but every effort met the quiet, deliberate resistance I maintained. The rings remained untouched, their symbolic power intact, their lessons slowly sinking in. Patience, observation, and measured response became the instruments through which I protected both what was mine and the values I intended to impart. I realized then that the rings were doing more than preserving family legacy, they were revealing character. Every glance, every gesture, every subtle attempt at entitlement was noted, consciously or unconsciously. I watched as she learned slowly that impatience and desire, untempered by respect, yielded nothing. The lessons embedded in generations of stewardship were manifesting before me, not through confrontation, but through quiet insistence on boundaries. The subtle tension in the room grew with each passing gathering. She continued to admire the rings, often asking innocuous questions about their history, their craftsmanship, the milestones in my life they had silently witnessed. Each query, though polite on the surface, carried an undercurrent of expectation, a hope that I might, even unconsciously, hand over what had been entrusted to me. I answered carefully, offering stories without ceding control, sharing memories without relinquishing stewardship. Every anecdote reinforced the lesson. Possession is not granted by desire alone. It is earned through understanding, respect, and alignment with values that transcend mere ownership. Over time, I noticed subtle signs of frustration. A finger tapped against a glass, a sigh escaped in moments she thought I wasn't looking, a sharper edge in a smile. These were minor, almost imperceptible, but they spoke volumes. They revealed impatience, a lack of understanding, the persistent pull of entitlement. Yet I remained composed, the rings ever present on my hands, their weight a reminder of responsibility. The daughter-in-law's reactions were becoming predictable, each gesture a confirmation of the lessons slowly taking hold. Desire, unaccompanied by discipline, yields tension, and tension, over time, reveals character. It became clear that she was beginning to recognize the boundaries, though she resisted admitting it openly. In her eyes, the conflict between longing and understanding was evident. She learned, however slowly, that the rings were not trophies to be claimed by mere aspiration. They were symbols of history, care, and respect, an inheritance of responsibility as much as material value. I allowed her observations to continue, maintaining calm and patience, knowing that the lesson would resonate more profoundly when self-realized rather than imposed. I recalled a principle my grandmother had instilled in me: true value is never grasped, it is understood. The rings, with their intricate designs and storied past, embodied this principle. Their beauty was secondary to their legacy. Each time the daughter-in-law reached for understanding rather than acquisition, I noted the shift. The lesson was manifesting subtly, guiding her through reflection and self-assessment rather than overt confrontation. Human nature, I had learned, responds more powerfully to controlled opportunity than to direct instruction. Our family gatherings became subtle exercises in testing patience and comprehension. I noticed how she adjusted her behavior around the rings, sometimes withdrawing her gaze, at other times leaning in slightly too much, attempting to gauge my reactions. I maintained an even demeanor, never offering access, yet never denying observation. The balance was delicate. The lesson required opportunity for reflection, but strict adherence to boundaries. In this measured environment, her intentions became increasingly transparent, revealing not only desire but also her capacity, or lack thereof, for understanding stewardship. I reflected on the pattern emerging. Desire untempered by comprehension and respect produces impatience. Entitlement unexamined produces expectation. The daughter-in-law, driven by longing for what she had not earned, was learning this truth in real time. Every glance, every gesture, every whispered question served as evidence of understanding, or misunderstanding, of the values the rings represented. Through patient observation, I saw the transformation begin, slow but unmistakable. Awareness, acknowledgement, and the subtle shift from expectation to reflection. She began to test boundaries indirectly, engaging my son in discussions about family heirlooms, hinting at admiration and interest, perhaps hopping for advocacy. He deflected, always mindful of my presence and the implicit lesson at hand. The daughter-in-law's polite persistence met with calm resistance, revealing the careful orchestration required to teach without confrontation. Her reactions, ranging from frustration to contemplation, underscored the effectiveness of restraint and subtle guidance. The rings, silent yet commanding, remained the focal point of the lesson. I found satisfaction not in denying her, but in witnessing her learning. The subtle power of patience and observation had always been underestimated, yet it proved formidable. Each interaction reinforced a principle: the possession of something precious is inseparable from the understanding of its value. The daughter-in-law's longing, previously unchecked, was now framed by recognition of responsibility. She was beginning to internalize the lesson that desire without comprehension leads to emptiness, a truth encoded within the weight of the rings themselves. In quiet moments, I contemplated the broader implications of this approach. Life, like the stewardship of inherited treasures, rewards those who understand responsibility over those who merely covet. The daughter-in-law's journey, though marked by subtle tension, mirrored the challenges I had faced in earlier years, learning that value is a product of respect, care, and comprehension rather than mere acquisition. The rings, emblematic of these lessons, became tools of reflection, guiding behavior and shaping understanding without overt admonishment. As weeks turned to months, I noticed incremental changes. Her glances, once sharp and probing, softened. Her questions, once tinged with expectation, became more measured, focused on understanding rather than acquisition. The lesson was taking root. Patience, observation, and careful guidance had reframed her perspective. Possession is earned through alignment with values, not simply claimed through desire. The rings, gleaming and unyielding, stood as silent arbiters of this truth, their legacy preserved not by force but by wisdom. I recognized that the true challenge lay not in the teaching, but in maintaining consistency. Human nature is easily tempted by the immediate and tangible. The daughter-in-law's impulses were predictable, yet manageable through steadfast observation and calm enforcement of boundaries. The subtle dance of proximity and restraint, praise and deflection, continued to reveal her understanding, or resistance. Each interaction reinforced a principle fundamental to inheritance. Value is inseparable from comprehension, desire unaccompanied by respect is hollow, and lessons unlearned remain burdens. Over time, she attempted to demonstrate awareness, taking small steps toward recognition of stewardship rather than expectation. A comment here, a deferential gesture there, each a sign that the lesson was registering. I acknowledged these moments silently, allowing them to accumulate in her consciousness, building understanding gradually. The rings, ever present, remained untouched, a visual and symbolic anchor for reflection. Desire had become tempered by awareness, impatience softened by observation, entitlement reframed by the lesson embedded in each piece of gold and diamond. I considered the broader pattern of human behavior that this scenario revealed. Greed often masquerades as admiration, entitlement as curiosity. Lessons imposed through confrontation frequently breed resistance, whereas lessons experienced through structured observation and measured guidance yield comprehension. The daughter-in-law's journey reflected this principle. By allowing her to witness, inquire, and reflect without access, I facilitated a transformation from unexamined desire to deliberate understanding. The rings, silent and radiant, were both the medium and the message. Her attempts to influence outcomes indirectly, through conversation, suggestion, or implication, gradually diminished. The lesson was becoming internalized. She began to recognize the boundaries not as restrictions, but as indicators of the responsibility inherent in value. The rings, symbolic of legacy and care, remained untouchable, yet increasingly respected. Desire alone could not bypass the framework of understanding. She was learning that acquisition without comprehension is ultimately empty. I reflected on my own satisfaction, not in denying access, but in witnessing growth. The daughter-in-law's gradual recognition of responsibility, her subtle adjustments in behavior, demonstrated that the lesson was working. Patience, observation, and measured response had transformed potential conflict into education, desire into reflection, and entitlement into recognition of the value of stewardship. The rings, shining silently, had fulfilled their dual purpose, preserving legacy and imparting understanding. Family gatherings continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The daughter-in-law's focus, previously sharp with unfulfilled longing, now included genuine curiosity and measured respect. She engaged in discussions about the rings with attentiveness, listening to stories, appreciating history, and acknowledging responsibility. The lesson, delivered through subtlety and consistency, was taking root. Greed had been tempered by reflection, and desire had begun to align with understanding. I realized with quiet satisfaction that the rings were no longer merely objects. They were teachers, mirrors reflecting intention, and instruments shaping character. The daughter-in-law's journey demonstrated a fundamental truth. Value is inseparable from responsibility, and lessons imparted through observation endure far longer than those imposed through confrontation. Each glance, each gesture, each inquiry revealed progress, measured not in material acquisition, but in comprehension and alignment with the principles embedded in the legacy. The final gatherings were different. Where there had once been subtle tension and furtive glances, now there was a quiet awareness, a recognition that the rings were more than ornaments. They were symbols of legacy, responsibility, and respect. The daughter-in-law's posture, once eager and calculating, had softened. Her inquiries, previously tinged with expectation, were now genuine questions seeking understanding rather than access. The lesson had taken hold, slowly and deliberately, as it was meant to. Desire had been transformed into comprehension, impatience into reflection, and entitlement into acknowledgement of stewardship. I observed her with a calm satisfaction. She was learning, not through lectures or confrontation, but through consistent boundaries, measured observation, and subtle guidance. The rings had done their work, silently teaching what words alone could not. Each glance she cast was now informed by respect and awareness. She had begun to understand that legacy is preserved not by possession alone, but by the comprehension of the value it represents. Her eyes, once sharp with desire, now reflected a growing appreciation for the responsibility inherent in holding something precious. The family noticed the shift as well. My son remarked on how she seemed more thoughtful, more attentive, and more respectful during conversations about the rings and our family history. Even the extended relatives, who had previously overlooked the dynamics, sensed the change. What had been a source of tension had evolved into an educational moment, a quiet reinforcement of values across generations. The rings, untouched and gleaming, had guided this transformation without a single confrontation. It became clear that the daughter-in-law was internalizing the lesson. She demonstrated patience when discussions turned to other heirlooms, attentiveness when histories were recounted, and subtle restraint in moments that would have previously prompted action or assumption. The rings had served as anchors, not merely of wealth, but of insight. Desire had been redirected into understanding, and untempered expectation had been replaced by recognition of responsibility. The lesson, carefully crafted and delivered, was complete. I reflected on the broader significance of this approach. Life, much like inheritance, teaches in patterns. Confrontation can provoke resistance, while subtle guidance and structured observation facilitate comprehension. Greed, desire, and entitlement are tested most effectively in the quiet spaces between opportunity and access. By maintaining calm, offering information without granting ownership, and allowing reflection to unfold naturally, the daughter-in-law had moved from aspiration to understanding. The rings had been the silent instructors, and she had at last listened. Her subtle gestures, now consistently respectful, signaled a deepening awareness. She no longer attempted to influence outcomes through indirect means, nor did she display impatience or frustration. Instead, she approached discussions with curiosity, attentiveness, and consideration. The rings had become more than objects; they were touchstones of wisdom, conduits of legacy, and instruments of reflection. In learning restraint, she had acquired more than she could have through possession alone: insight into stewardship, understanding of responsibility, and appreciation for history. The culmination of this transformation was evident during a quiet family gathering. She handled heirlooms with care, asked thoughtful questions, and acknowledged the stories and responsibilities attached to each piece. Her demeanor reflected comprehension, not calculation. The rings remained untouched, their physical presence intact, yet their lesson had been fully absorbed. The daughter-in-law had moved beyond superficial desire to meaningful recognition of value, understanding that possession is inseparable from respect and responsibility. I felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not in the denial of access, but in the successful imparting of a lesson that would endure. Patience, observation, and subtle guidance had achieved what confrontation could not. The rings had served their purpose, revealing character, teaching stewardship, and transforming desire into understanding. The daughter-in-law's journey demonstrated that true legacy extends beyond material inheritance. It encompasses wisdom, insight, and the careful cultivation of values across generations. The final reflection was simple but profound. The power of a lesson lies not in the force used to deliver it, but in the opportunity it provides for self-realization. The daughter-in-law had begun with desire, impatience, and entitlement, yet she concluded with comprehension, respect, and alignment with the principles embedded in the family legacy. The rings, silent and radiant, had guided her transformation. They remained, as always, a testament to patience, foresight, and the enduring strength of values carefully preserved and thoughtfully imparted. In witnessing her growth, I was reminded of the subtlety required in teaching and the potency of restraint. Desire untempered by understanding achieves little, entitlement unchecked breeds tension, but when lessons are delivered through measured observation, patient guidance, and structured opportunity, comprehension flourishes. The daughter-in-law's transformation was a clear demonstration of this truth. The rings had fulfilled their dual role, preserving heritage and imparting wisdom. Her empty hands, once eager for acquisition, were now a symbol of understanding, not deprivation. The family gatherings that followed were marked by a quiet harmony. The daughter-in-law's behavior reflected her internalized lesson. She engaged with curiosity, listened attentively, and treated heirlooms and family history with care. The tension that had once simmered beneath the surface had dissipated, replaced by respect, awareness, and acknowledgement of responsibility. The rings remained a silent testament, their legacy preserved, their lesson imparted. Desire had been transformed into comprehension, entitlement had been redefined as stewardship, and the family, witnessing this evolution, understood the depth of the principle at work. As the years passed, the story of the rings, the lessons they carried, and the transformation of the daughter-in-law became woven into the family narrative. It was a tale not of confrontation or denial, but of subtle instruction, patient guidance, and the enduring impact of wisdom embedded in legacy. The rings continued to gleam, untouched by impatience, yet powerful in their silent teaching. The daughter-in-law's hands, once eager, now reflected understanding, a living embodiment of the lesson. Value is inseparable from responsibility, and true inheritance is measured not in possession, but in comprehension. The months following the initial realization were quiet but transformative. The daughter-in-law, who had once navigated gatherings with a subtle mix of charm and calculation, now approached each encounter with a new awareness. The rings remained ever present on my fingers, their weight both literal and symbolic, a constant reminder of stewardship, patience, and legacy. She no longer attempted to touch them or insinuate influence. Instead, her curiosity became genuine, her questions thoughtful. She asked about the stories behind each ring, the occasions on which they were worn, the sacrifices and triumphs they had silently witnessed. And as she listened, truly listened, I could sense her perspective shifting, reshaping itself around understanding rather than desire. It was subtle at first, manifesting in small gestures, the way she handled other family heirlooms with care, the attention she paid when I spoke of history, the patience she exhibited when conversations drifted into moments that once might have tempted her to interject or claim. Each action, seemingly minor, was evidence of comprehension, an internalization of lessons long embedded in the family legacy. I realized then that teaching through presence, through silent insistence on respect and boundaries, was far more powerful than any lecture, argument, or confrontation. The rings were no longer just objects, they were instruments of insight, guiding behavior and shaping understanding with quiet insistence. At first her transformation felt incremental. One evening, while recounting the story of my grandmother's wedding ring, a delicate band that had survived generations, she interrupted not with a question about its value, but with genuine curiosity about the traditions surrounding it. "So it wasn't just a piece of jewelry," she said softly. "It was a symbol of choices, of commitments made long before any of us were here." Her voice carried a tone of realization I hadn't heard before, a quiet acknowledgement of the depth behind what I had long held sacred. I smiled, acknowledging her understanding without praise, allowing the moment to stand as its own lesson. Comprehension often speaks louder than accolades. The family noticed the change as well. My son, who had often mediated between her and myself, remarked privately how different she seemed. Gone was the subtle edge of expectation. In its place was attentiveness and patience. Even extended relatives commented on her newfound sensitivity to family history, her careful engagement with stories that had once been met with distraction or impatience. It was remarkable how quickly the dynamics of a household could shift when lessons were absorbed silently, without forced confrontation. The rings, ever present and untouched, were silent witnesses to a transformation that extended far beyond their physical presence. Over time, the daughter-in-law began to demonstrate initiative in ways I had not anticipated. She began documenting family stories, knotting details and relationships, ensuring that the history and care associated with heirlooms were preserved for future generations. It was as if the very act of observing the rings had awakened a sense of responsibility she had not previously understood. Her hands, once eager to acquire, now moved with deliberation, care, and awareness of consequences. The lesson had been internalized. True inheritance is not a matter of possession, but of comprehension, respect, and active stewardship. I observed her interactions with the younger members of the family with a quiet satisfaction. She shared the stories she had learned, teaching the next generation about the significance of each heirloom, the weight of history, and the necessity of respect. The rings had become a catalyst, not simply for her understanding, but for the cultivation of values across generations. Desire had been transformed into insight, entitlement into responsibility, and impatience into deliberation. Each gathering reinforced these lessons, embedding them deeper into the fabric of family life. One evening, during a particularly intimate gathering, she approached me directly. Her voice was steady, her eyes no longer searching for approval or access, but reflecting genuine comprehension. "I think I finally understand why these rings are so important," she said. "It's not just about the material value, it's about the stories they carry, the responsibilities they represent, and the care required to preserve them." I nodded silently, recognizing that the lesson had taken root. She had moved beyond superficial admiration into a space of genuine understanding, where respect for legacy and acknowledgement of stewardship guided her actions and choices. The transformation was not instantaneous nor complete, but it was profound. Her journey reflected the broader principle I had long observed. Character is revealed not in moments of opportunity or acquisition, but in the quiet spaces where desire is tempered by restraint, curiosity is shaped by respect, and understanding emerges from observation. The rings, their brilliance unchanged, continued to guide her behavior, silently affirming that stewardship is earned, not granted, and that true inheritance extends far beyond physical possession. I began to notice other subtle changes as well. The daughter-in-law's demeanor in conversation shifted from self-interest to genuine engagement. Her questions reflected interest rather than expectation, her gestures demonstrated care rather than calculation. Even when she encountered moments of temptation, an opportunity to touch a ring, a question that could have implied entitlement, she exercised restraint, allowing the lesson to guide her actions. It was a remarkable evolution, one that underscored the power of patient observation, subtle guidance, and consistent reinforcement of boundaries. As the seasons changed, the family gatherings became exercises in reflection and storytelling. The daughter-in-law's role shifted organically, from observer to participant, from eager aspirant to careful steward. She helped organize heirlooms, documented histories, and encouraged younger relatives to engage with family legacy thoughtfully. The rings, unchanged in physical presence yet potent in symbolic power, had achieved their dual purpose, preserving history while imparting wisdom. Desire had been transformed into understanding, impatience into reflection, entitlement into stewardship. I reflected on the broader lessons this experience offered. Human nature often gravitates toward acquisition, toward expectation, toward immediate gratification. Yet the most profound growth emerges through patience, observation, and the deliberate cultivation of understanding. The rings had served as catalysts, teaching lessons that words alone could not convey. The daughter-in-law had learned, gradually, that possession without comprehension is hollow, and that stewardship requires engagement, respect, and reflection. Her transformation continued to ripple throughout the household. The younger family members, observing her evolution, began to approach heirlooms and family history with greater attentiveness. Stories were preserved more diligently, lessons about responsibility were absorbed more deeply, and the culture of care extended beyond individual interactions to the broader family environment. The rings, though physically unchanged, had catalyzed a cultural shift. Desire was now tempered by understanding, entitlement replaced by responsibility, and appreciation guided by comprehension. In moments of quiet reflection, I realized the profound impact of this journey. The daughter-in-law, once focused solely on acquisition, had begun to embody the principles embedded in the rings. Her hands, previously eager, now moved with deliberation. Her gaze, once calculating, now reflected comprehension. Her actions, once motivated by desire, now demonstrated responsibility. It was a transformation that required patience, subtle guidance, and careful observation, yet its outcomes were enduring. Even my son, initially unaware of the depth of the lessons being imparted, remarked on the subtle but significant change in his wife. "She's different now," he said quietly. "More thoughtful, more aware, she's beginning to understand what these things really mean." I nodded, knowing that the rings had done their work, silent teachers, guiding behavior, shaping character, and fostering understanding across generations. The daughter-in-law began to take pride in her role, not in possession, but in stewardship. She ensured that heirlooms were cared for, histories recorded, and lessons preserved. Each gathering became a reinforcement of values rather than a test of patience. The transformation was not simply about the rings, it was about cultivating understanding, responsibility, and the recognition that true inheritance extends beyond material wealth. The lessons embedded in the legacy of my family were now actively transmitted, ensuring that future generations would inherit not just objects, but insight and comprehension. I reflected on the philosophy underpinning this journey. Life rarely teaches its lessons through confrontation alone. Subtle guidance, observation, and carefully maintained boundaries often yield deeper comprehension. The daughter-in-law's evolution demonstrated this principle in action. By allowing her to witness, to reflect, and to engage without granting access prematurely, she learned the value of patience, the significance of respect, and the necessity of understanding. The rings, silent and radiant, were conduits of wisdom, teaching without coercion, shaping behavior without force. Over time, I observed a profound shift in family dynamics. Conversations about history and legacy were richer, interactions more thoughtful, and relationships more attuned to respect and comprehension. The daughter-in-law's presence no longer carried tension or expectation. Instead, it embodied awareness and care. The rings had fulfilled their dual purpose, preserving legacy and imparting enduring lessons about stewardship, responsibility, and the proper understanding of value. Finally, in a quiet moment, the daughter-in-law approached me once more. Her hands were empty, her posture calm, her gaze reflective. "I understand now," she said softly. "It's not about having these things, it's about honoring them, understanding them, and caring for what they represent. I think I finally see what you were trying to show me." I nodded, recognizing that the lesson had been internalized. Desire had been transformed into comprehension, entitlement into stewardship, and impatience into reflection. The rings, shining quietly on my fingers, had achieved their purpose. They had preserved legacy, imparted wisdom, and transformed behavior. The daughter-in-law, once eager to acquire, now embodied understanding, respect, and responsibility. The family, observing this evolution, recognized the power of patience, observation, and subtle guidance. The legacy of the rings extended far beyond material value. It encompassed insight, stewardship, and the cultivation of character across generations.